They say that if you listen closely on a quiet night when the moon is round and low, you can still hear her. Not the moon, no, but the sea. You see, the sea remembers. Long after maps forget, after stones crumble and names fade into the wind, the sea keeps singing. And tonight, under this pale and patient moon, she is humming again. A soft and sorrowful tune, almost like breath, almost like prayer. They call it the lament of the west wind, though no one knows who first named it. It comes not with the tide, but with silence. And in that silence, if you allow your mind to float, not think, not search, just drift, you may begin to see it. No, not with your eyes, with something older, something deeper, a shimmer beneath the surface. A city not swallowed by time, but exhaled into myth. A place that may or may not have ever existed, and yet somehow you already miss it. Tartessos. The name rolls like honey over stone, like a forgotten word your soul once knew. A city said to have lived where the sun sleeps, in the furthest west of the ancient world, near the mouth of the Guadalquivir River, where land and water held hands in sacred dance. But Tartessos was not just a city. No, it was a feeling, a soft gleam in the marshes, a golden whisper in the air, a cradle of myth, of metal, of melody. The poets of long ago spoke of it with reverence, as if it were not of this earth at all. Herodotus, the curious traveler of time, hinted at her glories in the quiet spaces between his words. Even the Greeks and the Phoenicians, so often enemies, so often conquerors, grew hushed when they spoke of her. Because Tartessos was different, not built by men alone. Some believed the Titans shaped her rivers with their fingers, placed her stones with divine care, and gave her voice to the moon. There are those who say the city still lies beneath the mudflats of Andalusia, buried under salt and silence. That archaeologists have come close, that ruins have been touched, that echoes have been heard. But perhaps it doesn't matter where Tartessos is, only that we remember to wonder, because wonder is what keeps the old stories alive. Tonight, under the cloak of this slow-moving dusk, we don't need proof. We need only stillness, breath, and the quiet companionship of the sea. So close your eyes now. Let your body soften. Let your thoughts loosen like threads from an ancient tapestry. And listen, not with your ears, but with that tender part of you that still believes in forgotten kingdoms and gentle giants. The moon is rising, and she's singing again. Beneath the vineyards of Andalusia, under the old olive trees whose roots wrap around stories older than scripture, there lies a silence so ancient it doesn't echo, it breathes. Spain, as we know her today, is a land of sun and song. But long before her cathedrals pierced the sky, before her conquerors drew borders on parchment, and before her hills were carved by plows, there is something else, something deeper, something that still stirs when the earth is warm and the air carries the scent of fennel and stone. They say that in the south, near the place where the Guadalquivir River dreams its way to the Atlantic, the land has veins, not of blood, but of bronze, of silver, of gold. And if you could peel back the skin of Spain, gently, reverently, you'd find bones of a forgotten world. A world where Tartessos once lived. No one knows exactly where the city stood. Some say near Huelva, where fishermen sometimes find strange artifacts tangled in their nets, amulets not made by Roman hands. Others insist it lies beneath the mudflats of Diana, where migratory birds circle over landscapes that shift like memory itself. But perhaps the answer isn't where. Perhaps it's when, or even why, because Tartessos may not have been a city in the way we understand cities. It may have been a breath, a space between worlds, a meeting place of myth and matter, a shimmer between dusk and dawn. Archaeologists have dug. They've sifted through dust and fragments. They've mapped and scanned and speculated. And sometimes they've stopped, not because they found answers, but because they felt watched, as though the earth itself was reluctant to give up her secret. You see, Spain is not silent. She hums. She murmurs through the cork trees and through the cracks in old stones. And her oldest songs don't come from the north, from the castles or the conquests. They come from the south, from the river, from the marshes, from Tartessos. The Romans knew nothing of it. The Moors forgot it. But the wind still remembers. And sometimes when that wind rushes low through the valley and brushes against a half-buried ruin, it sounds like a sigh made not of sadness, but of patience, as if something is waiting for us to notice, to remember, to believe. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine sinking beneath the soil, not with fear, but with wonder. Imagine finding chambers carved by hands that vanished before time was counted. Imagine stepping into the breath of the Titans. What would you feel? Not fear, not grandeur, but stillness. The sacred kind. The kind that doesn't demand belief, only curiosity. So tonight, as you rest your head and drift between waking and sleep, let your spirit wander beneath the skin of Spain. Let it move like mist through the bones of the earth. And if you listen closely, you may hear the whisper. We were here, and we are not done. They say there was once a city that glistened, not in grandeur or power, but in the way morning dew clings to petals just before the sun rises. That city was Tartessos. It did not rise like Rome, with conquest and fire. It did not spread like Babylon, heavy with empire. Tartessos emerged like a breath, delicate and golden, at the edge of land and sea, between the waking world and whatever came before it. No one agrees on its architecture. Some imagine spiraling towers made of river stone and copper, their tips kissed by seabirds. Others speak of wooden platforms above the marshes, shining with embedded metals that caught the light just so, like the glint in a sleeping god's eye. But always the image returns to this light. Tartessos was a city made of light, or perhaps it was a place that reflected it so purely that the sun fell in love with her. Some ancient travelers wrote of how, approaching from the sea, the city would appear as a mirage, a glimmer on the horizon, like the earth's memory of a dream. And by the time you docked, the mist would lift and the scent of salt, myrrh, and distant metal would rise to meet you. This was no ordinary port. It wasn't just trade that passed through her, though the city was rich beyond imagination. Gold flowed through her like blood, silver like breath, and copper like the rhythm of her heart. But Tartessos did not hoard. She shimmered. To enter her was not to be conquered, but to be disarmed. And those who wrote of her, whether sailor, scholar, or seer, always used the language of wonder, not war. They spoke of streets that curved like riverbanks, of temples built not to tower, but to hum, to vibrate with the pulse of earth and water, of priests and priestesses who sang more than they spoke, of markets where you could trade salt for silence and silence for secrets. Imagine walking those streets, the ground beneath your feet warm from the sun, children's laughter echoing softly against whitewashed walls, a woman pouring water into a clay jar, her hands stained with saffron, birds circling above, not hurriedly, but as if in choreography, the air thick with the smell of crushed herbs, wood smoke, and something metallic but sweet. You would not know it immediately, but you would feel it. This city was not made by man alone. Some believe Tartessos was the last breath of the Titans. those first gods of form and fury who built the world and then retreated beneath it. They say the city shimmered because it remembered the stars, because it was built according to a geometry not taught but felt. And that's why she couldn't last. Because the world changed. Because man began to seek dominion, not harmony. Because gold became currency instead of offering. But here, in this city of dew and dawn that had not yet happened, here, the metals sang, the stones breathed, the people listened. Some even say the walls of Tartessos were not made of stone at all, but of something softer, like clay kissed by moonlight, or coral plucked from the dreams of the sea. She was a place between things, between myth and map, between earth and water, between memory and forgetting. And though her stones may lie buried, or dissolved, or never have existed at all, her shimmer still finds us, in dreams, in the hush before sunrise, in that strange feeling of longing we carry for things we cannot name. That is the light of Tartessos, not blinding, not burning, just glistening, like morning dew just before the sun comes. If Tartessos was the heart, then the river was her breath. It moved slowly, like something ancient remembering how to dance. And the locals, those who still dream in silence, called it the River of Two Hearts. But we know it now by another name, the Guadalquivir, a name that rolls from the tongue like the water it describes, long, low, serpentine, a river that cuts across the land like a scar or a whisper. They say it once flowed in two directions, not at once, perhaps, but like a mood, shifting when no one was watching, carrying salt inland on a full moon, and returning with secrets when the tide fell low. To live beside this river was to live between worlds, between land and sea, between fresh and salt, between what is and what was. No one ruled the river, not truly. Even the mighty Tartessians, with their silver and their songs, knew better than to tame it. They did not build bridges. They offered gifts. Each spring, when the waters grew restless and swelled with melted snow from distant mountains, the people of Tartessos would gather at its edge. And there, at the water's lip, they would place baskets. Baskets filled not with offerings of wealth, but of meaning. A lock of a child's hair for health. A pinch of soil for abundance. A folded note with no words, only symbols. Then they would watch as the river, slowly, deliberately, took what it pleased. Some baskets floated east. Some sank. Some disappeared entirely, as though the water had swallowed them into another realm. No one mourned what was taken, because the river always gave something in return. Sometimes a fish not native to the region. Sometimes a carved stone with unfamiliar markings. And once, they say, a baby sleeping in a cradle woven from reeds and wrapped in sky blue silk. No one knows where the baby came from, but she was raised in Tartessos and grew to become a priestess of the marshes, the one whose voice could quiet storms. You see, the river listened, not to prayers, but to intention, to the rhythm of hearts, to the pulse of the soil, to the silence between words. And Tartessos, unlike the cities that would come after her, did not speak over the river. She harmonized with it. Her docks were carved from driftwood, her homes shaped to bend with the water's moods, her temples built low and wide, so that when the floods came, they would not resist, but welcome the embrace. Some say this is why Tartessos cannot be found today, that she never truly sank. She was simply taken, pulled beneath by the river she trusted too much. And the river does not forget. No, even now, archaeologists speak of strange anomalies. Structures seen from satellite images that appear and vanish with the tides. Footprints of walls that flicker in and out of existence when the light hits the marshes just right. And local fishermen, those with more salt than blood in their veins, have stories they won't tell foreigners. But if you're quiet, if you sit beside the water at dusk and offer the river your silence, sometimes it speaks. It speaks in bubbling eddies, in reeds that move without wind, in the sudden hush of birds that freeze mid-flight. It speaks of a city made of sun and copper, of songs sung in forgotten tongues, of children who knew how to read the current like scripture. And once, one man claimed he saw her, the whole city glimmering beneath the surface, visible only for a heartbeat, as if the river lifted its veil just for him. He says he wept, not because she was beautiful, but because she looked back. You see, rivers are not roads. They are memories. They remember who loved them, who listened, who gave instead of taking. And for Tartessos, the Guadalquivir remembers it all. So if you ever find yourself beside that sacred flow, with the stars just beginning to blink above and the moon curled like a question mark in the sky, bend low, touch the water, and listen, not for answers, but for echoes, because some cities are not lost. They're just beneath the surface, waiting. Before Tartessos was silver and song, before gold bled from her rivers and prayers rose from her temples, there were footsteps in the hills. They say the ground remembers weight, and the southern mountains of Iberia still hold the echoes of the ones who walked before us. Not men, not quite. They were too large, too slow-moving, too still when they sat, like mountains that had learned to breathe. The people of Tartessos called them Los Hijos del Trueno, the children of thunder. Not because they brought storms, but because their voices were storms, low, rolling, eternal. Others say they were the last of the Titans. Not gods, but older. Not rulers, but founders. They did not build kingdoms. They carved space. Space for life. Space for wonder. Space for silence. Imagine standing at the foot of one, their faces like weathered stone, eyes too deep to see the end of, hand the size of fishing boats, calloused not from labor, but from shaping the world itself. They say the Titans came west when the earth was young, when the continents still murmured to each other in sleep. And it was here at the end of the land and the edge of the sea that they decided to rest. Not in death, but in creation. They took their memories, the glimmers of stars, the warmth of volcanic breath, the rhythm of tectonic sleep, and folded them into the marshes. They pressed them into the red soil and let them bloom into Tartessos. The city was their lullaby, a cradle made of metal, mist, and myth. Some stories speak of a Titaness named Ilvara, whose tears became the sacred springs that fed the city. She would rise at dusk, covered in moss and moonlight, to sing into the river, not with words, but with tones that bent the reeds and calmed the animals. Others whisper of Bronkel, the hammer-handed one, who cracked the hills open like fruit and poured silver into the hands of the first artisans. It said that he carved the very shapes of the first temples, not with tools, but with his fingers and his breath. But these were not myths meant to explain the world. They were meant to remember it. The Tartessians did not speak of the Titans as past. They spoke of them as present, as sleeping. They believed the Titans had simply gone beneath, into the caverns, the mountains, the bones of the earth, that their slumber held up the sky, that every earthquake was a shifting shoulder, every warm spring a sigh. Even today, in the hills above the old marshes, strange things are found. Massive stones, too smooth, too deliberate, resting in perfect alignment, though no tools could have moved them. Caves with ceilings charred black as if licked by ancient fire. And in one place, a footprint, 6 feet long, embedded in stone hardened like glass. Scientists label these anomalies. They measure, photograph, dismiss. But the wind has its own memory. and it doesn't need names. It carries the story of the first beings, of hands that pressed the land into music, of hearts that pulsed in time with the tides. Perhaps it's not so strange, then, that Tartessos shimmered, that it breathed and sighed and disappeared like a dream, because it wasn't made by those who cling to permanence. It was made by those who understood that everything sacred must one day dissolve. So tonight, as your breath softens and your limbs grow heavy, imagine the earth beneath you rising, slowly, gently, like the chest of a sleeping giant. Imagine that you are not alone, but resting in the arms of something vast and ancient, something that remembers when mountains walked and cities sang and silence was holy. The Titans are not gone. They are under us, around us, within us. They're the thunder that rolls through stone and the hush that follows. And Tartessos was their final lullaby. In the quietest part of the marsh, where the air grows thick like breath held too long, where the reeds grow in twisted patterns, and even the wind pauses to listen, there once lived a voice, not a person exactly, not just a woman or a priestess, but something older, something rooted. They called her Asha, or Isha, in the dialect of the salt herders, but most simply knew her as the oracle of the marshes. She did not live among the people of Tartessos. She lived beside them, on a raised mound surrounded by water, so still it reflected not just light, but memory. Her dwelling was no temple, no stone shrine or grand altar, just a hut of woven reeds, a mat of woven grasses, and a small fire that never smoked. Some claimed she had been there before Tartessos rose. Others whispered she had never truly been born, that she came from the mist itself, a gift from the river, a fragment of moonlight that had chosen to remain. No one remembered her age, only that she was always there, watching, listening, waiting. She spoke in riddles, or perhaps she never spoke at all. Those who visited her often left unsure whether they'd heard words, or simply felt them. She had no followers, no rituals, no demands, and yet, kings crossed the marshes barefoot to sit before her. Warriors wept in her presence without knowing why. Even the priesthood of Tartessos, with their jeweled robes and ancient chants, deferred to her silence. They say her eyes were gray, not from age, but from depth, like storm clouds that knew too much. And when she looked at you, it was as if something beyond time had stepped inside your skin and was quietly examining your soul. She saw things, not the future as we think of it, but possibility, fractures in the weave of time, the tremble of events before they fall into place. She saw what Tartessos was becoming, not its glory, but its grief. In her final days, or what we now believe to be her final days, she began to draw strange symbols on the floor of her hut. Circles inside circles, lines that curve away from the marsh, toward the open sea. A spiral, always a spiral, coiling inward and inward until it vanished in a single point of ink. She stopped speaking, stopped accepting visitors. Even the river, they say, rose up around her hut, not in anger, but in reverence, creating an island of isolation. And then, one night, the fire in her hut went out. No one saw it happen, but the next morning, fishermen claimed the marsh smelled different, like iron and rain. And the birds no longer nested near a mound. They found the hut empty, the symbols still etched in the clay. A single feather, black as night, placed at the center. No body, no remains, just silence. Some say she walked into the river and dissolved. Others believe the Titans called her back, that she was not of this world, but had lingered for love. And a few, those who dream in symbols and wake with tears, believe she still speaks. But only to those willing to sit alone in the mist and listen for things they cannot see. Today, the marsh remains. The reeds are thicker, the water darker. But if you find yourself there at dusk and the air suddenly grows heavy with memory, do not be afraid. That's just Asha watching. And if you are still enough, if your breath matches the rhythm of the wind, if your heart softens just slightly, you may hear her voice, not with your ears, but through the space behind your thoughts. A voice not of warning, but of remembrance. She does not beg us to save what was. She only asks that we do not forget, because Tartessos did not fall in a single moment. It unraveled, and she saw every thread before it slipped from the loom. Tonight, as you drift into sleep, know this: some wisdom does not come through language. It comes in silence, in the weight of mist, in the gaze of unseen eyes, and in the still, sacred places where time bends and listens. The oracle is gone, but she is everywhere. Tartessos, they say, knew how to sing before she ever learned to speak. Her people danced to the rhythm of rivers, offered prayers in the language of the wind, and measured wealth not in gold, but in harmony. But then they came, not with swords, but with smiles, not with armies, but with bronze. They came from the east, sailing through the pillars of Hercules, past the edge of the known world, following the scent of metals and mystery, drawn by rumors of a city bathed in light. They called themselves the Phoenicians, but to the people of Tartessos, they were simply the ones from Gator. Gator, what we now call Cadiz, was a city of traders, of sailors, of smoke-filled temples and clever eyes. It rose like a question on a sliver of island, where the sea kissed the land with restless devotion. And its people were beautiful, not in form, but in movement. They moved like serpents, spoke like poets, and smiled like they knew something you didn't. They brought gifts: amber from the Baltic, perfume from Tyre, spices that tingled the nose, silks that whispered against the skin, and bronze, so much bronze, shaped into mirrors and blades, coins and chains, beads and breastplates. To the children of Tartessos, it was magic. To their artisans, it was inspiration. To their elders, it was a warning. But warnings are easy to ignore when they glitter. The Phoenicians did not invade. They wove themselves in. They taught new ways to measure, new ways to weigh, new ways to want. And soon, Tartessos, once content to shimmer quietly at the water's edge, began to reach outward. Markets expanded. Temples grew grander. Offerings became transactions. Songs became contracts. The river still flowed, yes, but its voice grew quieter. A few old ones, those who still remember the oracle's gaze, whispered that the balance was shifting. That light was becoming glare. The priests of Tartessos, once humble stewards of song and tide, began wearing foreign ornaments. Their chants grew louder but emptier, and beneath it all, something stirred. The Phoenicians had not come for friendship. They had come for access, to gold, to silver, to the mines that gleamed like the sun's veins beneath Iberian soil. And Tartessos offered it freely, not out of weakness, but out of trust. That was her most sacred flaw. She believed in beauty. She believed that what is shared will be honored. She did not yet understand the difference between visitors and harvesters. The bronze smile of Gator was dazzling, but smiles, as we know, can hide teeth. There are tales, quiet, hidden in footnotes of forgotten scrolls, of agreements made in shadowed rooms, of sacred sites marked with signs not of the Titans, but of foreign gods, of rivers rerouted to favor trade over spirit. And slowly, like a song losing its breath, Tartessos began to dim. Not from war, not from plague, but from imbalance, from forgetting. She no longer glistened like dew. She gleamed now, harder brighter, unnatural. The glisten of coin, not spring. The shimmer of market stalls, not stars. The Phoenicians built altars on her shores, carved their symbols into her stones, and left behind children, half of Tartessos, half of Gator, who spoke both tongues but knew neither. They did not come to destroy her. And yet, she began to fade, because not all ruin arrives with thunder. Some comes with charm, with sweet words, with bronze smiles. And tonight, as you close your eyes and feel the hush of sleep approach, remember this: not all guests come to stay, and not all exchanges are equal. Some cities fall not from outside force, but from a slow forgetting of who they are. Tartessos forgot, for a time, and the seeds of her unraveling took root beneath the feet of men who smiled too easily. They called him Argantonio, the Silver One, though some say it was not silver he carried in his name, but the weight of time, a king who reigned longer than memory. So long, in fact, that some began to believe he was not born, but forged. Forged from metal and moonlight, from sorrow and sunlight, from the ache of a city that knew too much. He ruled Tartessos not with a crown, but with presence. He walked among the river folk barefoot, his cloak trailing softly behind him, stitched not with gold, but with threads of seaweed, blessed by the oracle before she vanished in a mist. Argantonio was not like other kings. He did not raise armies. He raised questions. Why do we take more than we give? Why do we listen only after silence has grown too loud? Why do we forget what the river gave us? They say he ruled for 80 years, perhaps more. Too long, the scribes whispered. Too long to be mere man. The Greeks, ever fascinated, spoke of him with a mix of awe and unease. How could one man outlive generations of rulers? What magic flowed in his veins? But it wasn't magic. It was grief. You see, Argantonio loved his city, not as a possession, but as a child. And like any father watching a beloved soul grow distant, he watched Tartessos change with a heartbreak too quiet to name. He had welcomed the Phoenicians with open arms. He saw in them a mirror of his own curiosity, travelers, seekers, lovers of craft. He trusted them, and for a time, they honored that trust. Trade bloomed. Streets shimmered with new colors. Foreign songs mingled with native rhythms. The city pulsed like a heart newly awakened. But then came the hunger. Subtle, silent, patient. Not for food, but for control. And Argantonio saw it. Felt it. He noticed how his advisors no longer looked at the stars for guidance, but at ledgers. He noticed how the river no longer carried offerings, but debts. And he noticed how the people began to look past him, toward other voices, other gods, other promises. He tried to speak, tried to remind them, but the city, now gleaming with copper and greed, had grown restless. There are stories, quiet ones, told only in the twilight spaces between generations, that Argantonio would walk alone at night, his feet tracing the old paths of Tartessos before the stones were laid. He would kneel beside the water and speak, not in command, but in confession. "Forgive me," he would whisper. "I thought I could protect you." One night, a fisherman claimed he saw the king standing knee-deep in the river, his arms raised to the moon, his eyes closed, his body trembling not from cold, but from remembering. No one saw him the next morning. They say he vanished, or perhaps he returned, not to the palace, but to the earth, because Argantonio was not meant to die. He was meant to dissolve, to become part of the land he loved. Some believe his spirit rests in the stones beneath the old city, that if you press your ear to the ground, you can still hear his breath, slow, heavy, waiting. Others say he walks still, disguised as a herder or a madman, his eyes silver in the right light. his hands calloused with memory. But I believe this. That Argantonio was the last true voice of Tartessos, the last to speak to the Titans in the language of dreams, the last to hear the river sing in its first tongue. And when he vanished, the city began to fall, not in flames, but in forgetting. Tonight, as your eyelids grow heavy and your thoughts drift like leaves on a slow-moving tide, think of a man made not of power, but of presence, a man who ruled by listening, who loved his city more than himself, who watched beauty slip through his fingers and still stood in reverence of it. Some kings build empires. Argantonio built memory, and memory, though it fades, never truly disappears. There was a time when salt was sacred, not just a seasoning, not just a preservative, but a symbol, a whisper from the sea, a crystallized breath from the gods, a gift left behind when the tides pulled away, as though the ocean had exhaled its soul onto the earth. In Tartessos, salt was life. It was used to cleanse wounds, to seal vows, to bless births, to prepare the dead. The priest would scatter it along thresholds, believing it kept the forgotten at bay. Lovers placed it beneath pillows to dream the same dream. And when a child was born, a pinch was placed beneath the tongue, a ritual meant to bind the newborn to truth. But then something changed. It began slowly, like the first drop of sourness in a cup of wine, barely noticeable, almost dismissible. The salt, they said, began to darken. At first, it was a trick of the light, they thought, a shadow cast by clouds, a result of new trade, a contamination from foreign spices brought in by the Phoenicians. But it continued, on the altars of the Temple of the Waters. Salt once white as moonlight began to grow tinged with rust. Not red, not quite, but stained. Priests found it caked to the base of the offering bowls. Rougher, grittier, as if it had lost its purity. The ceremonial floors, once dusted in fine crystalline powder, began to feel sticky beneath bare feet. And at night, when the candles were snuffed and the temple lay quiet, some swore they could hear it, crackling, as though the salt was breathing. Then came the blood. One morning, the high priestess entered the sanctum and found a thin red trail seeping from the carved grooves around the main altar, the salt bleeding like an open wound. There was no source, no sacrifice, no injury, only salt, soaked crimson and cold to the touch. The people were frightened. Some believed it was a warning, that the river had turned against them, or the Titans had stirred in their sleep. Others whispered of Asha, the vanished oracle, and whether her silence had not been a withdrawal, but a curse. The city responded in ritual, wider offerings, longer chants. Salt burned in sacred fire, thrown into the sea, buried beneath new-built shrines. But nothing changed. The salt continued to bleed, and the priests began to fall ill. Slowly, subtly, they lost their voices. Their skin grew brittle. Their dreams were invaded by visions of a city half submerged, its temples dark, its children weeping salt instead of tears. Even the fish in the marshes grew fewer, and the birds that once gathered around the salt basins vanished without song. It was as if the city was being returned, not to ruin, but to origin, because salt, for all its purity, is also a sign of death. Where salt gathers in excess, nothing grows. Where it spreads unchecked, land turns to silence. And Tartessos had forgotten that. In her reach for foreign metals, for measured wealth, for foreign gods dressed in bronze, she had loosened the delicate balance between gift and greed. The salt was not angry. It simply responded. The earth does not punish. It mirrors. And what it showed now was a city beginning to rot from the inside out. Temples became tombs. Rituals became repetition. The salt, once sacred, became evidence. And the people, once proud and songful, began to whisper not of omens, but of endings. Some fled, others buried their mirrors, and still others took to silence, as if words might disturb whatever still listened beneath the floor. They say the last rites performed in the Temple of the Waters were not for gods, but for the salt itself, that the priests, what few remained, gathered in a circle, each holding a bowl of seawater mixed with ash, and together they wept into it, not from fear, but from mourning. They understood, then, that the salt had turned not because of betrayal, but because the story was ending. And all stories, especially sacred ones, bleed before they fall silent. Tonight, if you taste a bitterness in your mouth as sleep begins to fold around you, perhaps it is not your tongue. Perhaps it is memory. The memory of a city that forgot its sacred contract. A city that watched the sea retreat and left behind a trace, white at first, but slowly turning red. Tartessos bled long before it died, and the salt was the first to speak. There comes a moment in every great unraveling when the air itself seems to pause, when the wind forgets to move, the birds forget to sing, and even the water stills, as if something ancient has entered the room, and everything else must wait. They say such a moment came to Tartessos, and it was not a day of disaster, or war, or fire. It was a day of nothing. A day so silent that the children stopped playing mid-laugh. A day when the forgers paused mid-swing, and the priests stepped out of their temples. Not because they were called, but because they felt watched. It began just after dawn. The sun rose, but not with its usual golden grace. It came up pale, muted, its light more shadow than shine, as if it, too, was unsure whether it should rise at all. And then, everything stopped. No wind, no tide, no voice, just the weight of stillness, pressed against the skin like invisible hands. It wasn't fear, not yet, more like awe, the kind that makes you whisper without knowing why, the kind that makes your breath feel too loud in your own ears. The farmers in the outer fields stood still, their tools dangling useless in their hands. The animals refused to move. Horses wide-eyed, dogs curled tightly against the earth, goats clustered together in eerie silence. And in the marshes, nothing moved. Not the reeds, not the birds, not even the insects. It was as though time had slowed to a crawl, and the city had been placed inside a great glass dome, watched from above by unseen eyes. The high seer of the Temple of Dust later wrote, on a scroll now lost to time, that it was as though the gods had placed their finger upon the world and whispered, "Wait." And they did. They waited. For what? No one knew. For whom? No one dared ask. But beneath that silence, beneath that fragile hush, something began to shift. It was not a noise, not yet a quake, but a tension, a tightening, a gathering, like the breath between thunderclaps. You know that moment, don't you? When a storm builds behind the mountains, and the air grows thick, and the trees go still, and your skin begins to tingle with electricity that hasn't yet been born. That was what Tartessos felt. For one long, suspended day, the elders said nothing. The children wept without knowing why. Lovers clung to each other. Fishermen sat beside their boats, unwilling to touch the water. And above them all, the sky grew heavier, not darker, just full, as if the clouds were waiting for permission to speak. And still, the silence held. Some say it lasted an hour, others the whole day, and there are those who believe it never truly ended. That part of Tartessos remained frozen in that breath, locked in the eternal pause before the fall. Because that's the cruel kindness of silence. It gives you space to feel what's coming, to sense the weight before it lands. In that stillness, the people of Tartessos felt something that no oracle, no priest, no visitor from Gator had ever told them. They felt that their city was tired, not broken, not defeated, just exhausted. Exhausted from beauty misunderstood, from trust misplaced, from sacred balance pushed too far for too long. And in that silence, they mourned not the end, but the knowing that they were part of a story that would soon close its eyes. And perhaps that was the gift, that single moment, the last time Tartessos stood whole in herself, not in glory, not in wealth, but in truth. A truth so quiet it could only be heard when the world stopped moving. So tonight, if your room feels still, if your breath feels heavy, if the darkness around you seems to listen, don't be afraid. You're simply within the silence. The same silence that once wrapped itself around a golden city, just before the storm came. And sometimes the silence is the only part of the story that remains. Some nights do not belong to time. They are not remembered because of what happened, but because of how the world felt as it happened. There was such a night in Tartessos, a night when the air tasted of copper, when animals hid without command, and even the old, unshakable stones of the city shivered. They called it, later, La Noche en que ese hunter Las Estrellas. The night the stars sank. It began with light, not the kind that rises from the east, not the kind born of fire or moon, but a brighter, crueler brilliance, white and gold, with edges that seared the eyes and made the sky itself retreat. Just after the last bird call faded from the marshes, just as mothers were laying woven blankets over their sleeping children, the heavens opened. At first, it looked like a falling star, a streak of silver dragging a long sigh of flame behind it. But it didn't vanish. It grew, downward, faster, hungrier. Some claimed it was a gift from the gods, a burning chariot sent by Ilvara, the tidiness of sky and spring, returning to awaken her lost city. Others ran to the temples, crying warnings, not from fear, but from recognition, because deep down in the bones of Tartessos, they knew the stars were not falling. They were being pulled. The light hit the edge of the marshes, and there was no explosion, no sound of impact, only a pulse, a great shuddering ripple that moved through the earth. The water, the blood, torches flickered out without wind, mirrors cracked without touch. Birds fell mid-flight, their wings folding as if in reverence. And then came the light again, not from above, but from below. The water glowed, pale blue at first, then a bruised violet, as if the marsh itself had swallowed the fallen star and begun to dream in color. The rivers stopped flowing, not froze, stopped, and the people gathered at the banks, their faces lit by water that should not have shimmered, watching shapes move beneath the surface. Some said they saw figures, tall, slow, gliding like memory through glass. Not human, not fish, not shadows, but reminders. Reminders of something before. Before the city, before the names, before the forgetting. That night, nothing burned, nothing screamed. There were no fires, no waves. Only the weight of awe, a sense that something had returned. Or perhaps something had simply been revealed. Something the city had forgotten it once belonged to. The temples filled with people who didn't pray. They just sat and listened, not to the priests, not to the chants, but to the deep hum that rose from the stones themselves. A low, steady vibration, like the breath of a sleeping giant beneath their feet. And for the first time in generations, the city went utterly, perfectly silent. Even the bronze bells of the traders' quarters stilled. A single boy, no more than 7, walked into the glowing marsh and did not sink. He walked barefoot through the light, and when he returned, he held a stone. Smooth, black, warm. He said it sang. No one asked what the song was, because they already knew. It was the sound of returning, of the stars falling back into the sea, of Tartessos remembering what she was always meant to be. Not a city, not a capital, but a threshold. That night, the stars did not fall to punish. They fell to reclaim, to remind the people that they were not at the center of the story, but resting delicately in its margins. For a moment, and that moment was ending. By morning, the water had dimmed. The river moved again. The sky returned to its soft, forgetful blue. But Tartessos was different, quieter, older, more beautiful, but only in the way a face becomes beautiful just before tears. Because they understood now. Something had come to warn them, to prepare them, to invite them, perhaps one last time, back into balance. And the city, still half asleep, stood on the edge of that invitation. Tonight, as you lie in the dark, let your breath slow. Feel the hush between the heartbeats. That's where Tartessos lives now, in the quiet places where the stars once sank, and the sky remembered how to fall. Long before the fall, when the city still glowed with dreams, Tartessos held one final celebration, a festival so luminous, so breathless, that the gods themselves, some say, turned their eyes away, not out of anger, but out of shame, because what Tartessos offered that night was too beautiful, too human, too close to the divine for even the heavens to endure. It was called La Noche de las Llamas y las Plumas, the night of flame and feather. It was not recorded in scrolls, not etched into temple walls, but passed from voice to voice, like embers kept alive between generations. It was held only once, and it was never meant to be repeated. The festival was born not from tradition, but from instinct, a collective yearning that rippled through the city like a memory of light. The stars had fallen, the salt had bled, the silence had spoken, and so, in answer, the people of Tartessos did not retreat. They danced. They gathered by the thousands in the plaza beneath the temple of sky and river. Young and old, healers and fishmongers, children with palms painted in ochre, elders with eyes like still water. In their hands, they carried feathers, dyed in crimson, cobalt, and gold. Gifts from sacred birds no longer seen in the marshes. Each feather was said to carry a prayer, not a plead, but to remember. At the center of the plaza, a great ring of fire was built, low and wide, fed not by wood, but by the dried vines of the past year's harvest, mixed with oils from the olives left too long in the sun. The flames rose not in chaos, but in rhythm, swaying gently, breathing with the crowd. And then came the dancers. They were not priests. They were not nobles. They were girls, barefoot, clothed in white linen, their arms and legs painted with lines of silver dust. They stepped into the ring one by one, each carrying a single feather and a coal wrapped in leaves. And when they moved, the entire city held its breath. They did not leap. They did not spin. They flowed like water through reeds, like wind through tall grass, like the last soft chord of a song you never knew you needed to hear. Their feet kissed the hot ground, leaving behind faint traces of ash and light. Their hands traced symbols into the smoke. Forgotten words, perhaps, or memories too sacred for speech. The drums grew louder. A second ring formed, elders chanting low, their voices rough with age and salt. They sang not in words, but in tones that curled around the flames, rising like offerings to the sky. Above them, the stars flickered. One by one, the dancers placed their feathers into the fire, and as each burned, the flames shifted, color, height, rhythm, as if the fire was listening. Some say they saw figures in the smoke, tall, slow-moving, arms outstretched, titans, watching, remembering. Others wept, not from sadness, but from a beauty so total it ached. And then, as the final dancer stepped forward, her face streaked with tears, her body trembling from something not of this world, the fire did something no one expected. It fell inward, collapsed into itself, not extinguished, but consumed. There was no sound, only the sudden, total hush, as if time itself had bowed in reverence. And in that silence, the city felt one final, impossible thing. Peace, not joy, not salvation, but the deep, quiet knowing that comes just before the end. When you stop running, when you stop begging, and simply let go. That was the last festival Tartessos ever held. There were no speeches, no declarations, no farewells, only ashes on the plaza floor, and the faint scent of feathers burned not in anger, but in love. Some say the gods turned away that night, not because Tartessos offended them, but because the people, for a single breath, became them, became what the divine always hopes to see in the human. Not perfection, but remembrance. Tonight, as the world around you slips into its own hush, let the fire of that dance warm your thoughts. Let your breath slow, your limbs soften, and know that somewhere, beneath layers of salt and time and myth, there's a circle of scorched earth that once pulsed with the footsteps of those who chose to meet the end with movement and light and beauty. The fire is gone, but the dance remains. There are places in the world where time grows thick, where the air feels older than the sky, where even the light bends differently, as though it, too, has learned to listen. Beneath one such place, under the shade of a lone olive tree that has stood longer than the empire of Rome, longer than the language we now speak, there is a door. Not a door you can see, not a hatch or a stairwell or a hatch-marked stone, but a feeling, a pull in the soles of your feet, a hush in your lungs, a tightening in your throat that whispers. You are not alone down here. They found it by accident. A team of archaeologists chasing whispers of Tartessos in the Andalusian plains. Their tools were modern, their methods precise, but it wasn't precision that led them to the chamber. It was a fault in the earth, a thin fracture that ran beneath an olive grove, where the trees bore fruit too small, too bitter, yet strangely untouched by rot. One night, while mapping subsoil anomalies, they noticed something odd, a low-frequency vibration, soft, steady, almost deliberate. It pulsed beneath a particular tree, the largest in the grove, its roots twisting like ancient fingers gripping secrets. They began to dig, carefully, lovingly, and beneath those roots, at exactly the depth of a man lying still, they found stone, but not just any stone. It was smooth, warm to the touch, marked with symbols no one could read, but everyone recognized. Spirals, eyes, lines that curved inward and ended in a point, like a whisper returning to silence. Beneath that stone, they found the chamber. It was not large, no more than the size of a single room, a space for 10 or 12 souls at most. But the moment they opened it, they felt something change. The temperature dropped, not cold, but still. The air grew dense, as though thick with the breath of things that no longer spoke. And in the center of the chamber, they found a slab, flat, polished, ringed by tiny copper bowls now green with time. Above it, the root of the olive tree had grown downward, piercing through the earth like a vein, its tip brushing the center of the slab. And there, where root met stone, was a stain, not a mold, not of rot, but of something older, red, dark, dried, blood perhaps. or memory made physical. No one could explain it. Not the scholars, not the linguists, not the machines they brought in to test the air. But those who entered the chamber reported something strange. Their dreams changed. They began to see a city of gold in twilight, its streets flooded with stars. They heard voices soft, rhythmic, not in warning, but in welcome. Some wept. Some refused to return. One woman, a linguist named Mireya, claimed she could hear music in the walls. Not instruments, but bones humming. She began to speak words she'd never studied, her mouth forming syllables she didn't understand. But when played back, they matched fragments from the lost inscriptions found in Phoenician shrines. Her team called it coincidence. She called it remembering. Others came and went, cataloged, photographed, measured, but none of their data could explain why birds refused to nest near the tree, why bees circled the entrance without entering, or why compasses spun without wind. What they had found was not a tomb, not a temple. It was a witness, a place where Tartessos had come to listen, a place where prayers were not shouted, but whispered into stone, where tears were not wiped, but offered, where silence became a bridge to something not human, but kind. Some say the slab is where the last priestess lay, offering herself to the Titans before the end. Others believe it is older still, that the Titans themselves knelt there once, hands pressed to the earth, listening for the heartbeat of the world. Whatever truth lingers in that chamber, it does not ask to be believed. It asks only to be felt. To enter, it is not to find answers. It is to remember that there are questions so old, so vast, they do not wish to be solved, only held. And tonight, as the dark curls around your quiet body, as your breath slows and your mind begins to drift, imagine yourself beneath that olive tree, the stars above you, the earth below, and deep within it, a space carved by love, sorrow, and the kind of silence that sings. The chamber is still there. The root still touches stone. The stain has not faded. And if you listen closely, through dream, through time, through soil, you may feel it. A hum, a pulse, a memory, waiting. Gold was once a gift, not a currency, not a measure, but a blessing, a breath from the bones of the world, risen through rock and time to rest in the hands of the gentle. In Tartessos, gold was not hoarded. It was woven into the fabric of the sacred, mixed with oils to anoint the newborn, inlaid into the handles of ceremonial knives that were never used, poured into grooves carved around the bases of altars, where it glistened like sunlight captured in stone. It was said that the Titans had left it behind, not as treasure, but as memory. Memory made metal, a soft, glowing echo of their breath still pulsing beneath the surface of the earth. But the world changed, and gold, once sweet, soft, spiritual, began to harden. It started with a foreign voice, a merchant from Gator, whose hands never touched the soil, but whose eyes were always measuring. He came to the priests of Tartessos with maps, with scales, with new words: yield, extraction, expansion. The priests, weary of omens and stained salt, listened, and so began the turning. The minds of Tartessos, once shallow, respectful incisions into the hillside, grew deeper, wider, hungrier. The old miners who sang as they worked, who placed garlands at the mouths of tunnels before every descent, began to die, not from collapse, not from flood, but from something slower. Their hands trembled, their mouths grew dry, their dreams stopped coming, their songs fell silent, and into their place came men with harder tools, brighter eyes, and quieter hearts. They stripped the hills bare, drained the silver veins like blood from a dying beast, pulled gold from the bones of the land with no ritual, no reverence. and the land responded. The rivers grew clouded. The fish grew thin and glass-eyed. The olives on the southern slopes turned black before ripening. The women of the village said the air tasted different. The children began to speak of shadows in the quarry, tall, slow-moving figures that watched but did not blink. No one listened, because the gold was coming faster now, more than ever before. Coins were minted, stamped with new seals. Trade boomed. Gators sent ships. Egypt sent emissaries. Even Athens sent whispers of interest. And Tartessos began to forget. She forgot the songs sung over her, forgot the names of the hills that bled, forgot the ancient rule passed from seer to priestess. Do not take what the mountain does not offer. Instead, they demanded, and the mountain grew tired. One morning, a boy, barefoot and quiet, walked into the great temple with a stone in his hand. Not gold, not silver, but something new, something dark, hard, brittle. He handed it to the high priest and said only, "The gold has turned." That afternoon, the mines flooded, not with water, but with light, blinding, white, unnatural. The workers never screamed. They simply disappeared when the tunnels were opened again. No bodies were found, no tools, no carts, only footprints burned into the stone, and a single feather, blackened and curled, resting atop a pile of untouched gold. The city tried to continue, tried to smile, tried to trade, tried to pretend that wealth had not become a wound. But gold no longer gleamed. It glared, and those who wore it began to fall ill. Jewelry turned hot against the skin. Statues melted without flame. And the great basin in the center of the market, once filled with golden coins, began to leak. Blood. The high priest declared a test. The traders called it superstition. But the old ones, the last who remembered the oracle's voice, began to whisper. The Titans are stirring, because Tartessos had not just taken too much. She had forgotten how to give back. The earth will bear anything until it no longer can. And when gold turns bitter, when memory becomes commodity, when offerings become theft, something must give, something must break. Tonight, as you lie in stillness, think of the gold we carry, not in our hands, but in our hearts, in our obsessions, in our blindness. Think of the cities we build from wanting, in the silence we bury beneath our ambition. Tartessos did not fall in fire. She dissolved in hunger, and the gold she once wore like a crown became the stone tied to her ankles as she sank beneath the tides of time. Water remembers. It forgets nothing, not your reflection, not your footsteps, not your sins. It carries memory deeper than stone, smoother than bone, more patient than any priest or poet. And so when Tartessos forgot herself, when her offerings turned to transactions, when her sacred songs were replaced by the sharp clink of trade, the river did not rage. She waited. The Guadalquivir had always been more than a river. She was a mother, a mirror, a messenger between worlds. She flowed not just through the land, but through the dreams of the people. She was prayed to, sung to, touched with reverent fingers by those who understood her moods. She rose with the moon. She fell with the tide. She whispered through the reeds at night, telling stories in ripples. But even the most patient of mothers can only watch her children drift so far before her current begins to turn. It started with small things. A fisherman woke to find his boat tangled in reeds that hadn't grown there before. A child dipped her hand into the water and pulled it out slick with something black, shimmering like oil but cold as ice. A merchant found his crates, left too close to the bank. Half sunk by morning, the wood bloated and humming faintly with rot. The elders grew quiet. The river, they said, had changed her face. She still flowed, still shimmered in the sun, still curved like a lover's sigh through the marshlands. but she no longer looked back when you looked into her. The priests offered incense. The seers burned herbs and sang. They poured fresh milk into the waters, cast coins from silver altars. But the river did not speak. Instead, she began to rise, not with the violence of flood, but with the slow, steady determination of something that had made a decision. She climbed over her banks during a cloudless week. She soaked the edges of the city, not in rage, but in grief. Crops drowned in fields where they had once sung in rows. Stone paths disappeared beneath inches of murky silence. Wells filled not with sweetness, but with silt and a bitterness that made animals turn away. And still, the people hoped. They said it will pass. The river is moody. It is only a season. But then came a night of red water. A caravan returning from the mines arrived at the eastern gate, caked in mud, carrying no gold, only fear. They spoke of a tremor near the source, of water bubbling from the ground like blood from a reopened wound. And the river had turned, not fully, not violently, just red, a deep, muted hue like old wine left in the sun. Not enough to kill, but enough to unsettle. Priests gather by torchlight and declared a warning. But warnings are only useful to those still willing to listen. And Tartessos was tired of listening. That night, they say, the river sang. Not in beauty, not in blessing, but in mourning. A low, guttural sound, almost inaudible unless you pressed your ear to the stone. A sound of loss, a betrayal, because Tartessos had broken the contract. The old one, the unspoken one, the law that says, I give and you receive, but you must also remember me. And Tartessos had remembered everything, trade, expansion, ambition, except the source of its own breath. The river no longer flowed for them. She flowed through them, around them, past them, as if they were already a memory, already a ghost. Floods came, brief, precise, like fingers wiping clean the edges of the city. Warehouses collapsed. Market stalls sank. A bridge built in haste cracked in the center with no quake. The people called it punishment, but punishment is for crimes. This was grief, a mother mourning her child, not out of anger, but because she could no longer carry the weight of who that child had become. Tonight, as you lie near your own river, be it memory, blood, or dream, ask yourself, do you still listen to it? Do you still honor its silence? Do you still recognize the voice of the thing that gives you life? Because Tartessos did not fall when the river rose. She fell when she stopped remembering that the river was not hers, that it never was. It was only ever visiting, and when it left, it took everything that had forgotten how to be still. There are things the earth forgets, shallow things, footsteps that didn't matter, words spoken without soul, promises made only once and never kept. But some things she remembers forever, especially names. Names spoken in reverence. Names carved with trembling hands. Names whispered into the stone before death. Not in despair, but in longing. And Tartessos, even as her light dimmed, even as her river turned away and her gold curdled into grief, still had stones, and her stones still remembered. The people had stopped praying, stopped dancing, stopped singing, but they still walked. Even in the final days, they walked the sacred paths, those narrow corridors between the temples and the hills, where moss clung to the sides of old shrines, and sunlight broke through in threads, not beams. These paths led to the stone garden, a place not marked on any map, not guarded, not spoken of in trade. It was never a graveyard. It was a listening place. There, the people of Tartessos had placed stones for centuries. Not tombstones, not monuments, but markers, round, smooth, each etched with a single name. No dates, no titles, no explanations, Just names, given to the stone, and then left in silence. Some were laid by parents after losing a child too young for memory. Others by lovers whose hands never found each other again. Some by the elderly, who knew they would soon vanish, and wanted the earth to carry their echo. And it is said that in this garden, if you walked slowly, if you let your fingers trail along the surface of each stone, you could hear it. Not a voice, not language, but a sound, a deep, low resonance, as if the stones hummed with the names they bore, vibrating gently in the key of grief. But even grief in Tartessos was sacred. They did not fear it. They wore it gently, like a shawl passed down through generations. To grieve was to remember. To remember was to love. And to love was to endure. In the final weeks of the city, as the waters grew restless and the marshes swallowed more than they gave, the stone garden became more than sacred. It became full. The people wordlessly returned to it. They brought new stones, smooth river rocks, polished by hand, and placed them with the same care as their ancestors had. Children who never spoke, lovers who left, friends whose names were almost forgotten, and the names written in trembling hands were not of the fallen, but of those still living, because deep down, they knew Tartessos would not survive, but her people, their names, could, and so they gave them to the earth, to the stones, to the place that remembers when we no longer can. There is one stone in particular, larger than the rest, darker too. Not volcanic, but so smooth it seems unnatural. No name is etched on it, just a spiral. Small, perfect, coiled tightly at the center like a question unanswered. Some believe this was the oracle's name, never spoken aloud. Others say it was the name of Tartessos herself. Not the city, but the soul of her. That stone, they say, hums loudest. If you press your ear to it, it does not sing. It does not cry. It just breathes, like something asleep, like something waiting, like something still, impossibly alive. Today, the stone garden is gone, buried beneath layers of silt and salt and centuries of forgetting. But sometimes when the river draws back just enough, when the sun sets in just the right hue of rust and violet, a shape can be seen beneath the surface. Round, still, markless, but listening. And tonight, as your breath begins to deepen and the quiet wraps itself around your ribs, remember that your name, too, is being carried somewhere beneath the skin of the world. Some stone bears a sound that only your soul can speak. It waits for no reward, no witness, only for you to remember that nothing sacred is ever lost, is only placed into the hands of the earth, where memory hums forever. There's a kind of darkness that is not frightened, not the darkness of night, not the velvet hush between dusk and sleep, but a wrongness, a stillness too complete. It came to Tartessos on a morning that should have begun like any other. The fires had been banked through the night. The stars had wheeled their slow, ancient dance across the sky, and the river had fallen into its steady rhythm again. Silent, silver, patient, but the sun did not rise. Not behind a veil of cloud, not filtered through storm. It simply did not come. The sky lightened slightly, just enough to paint the horizon in bruised lavender, then froze there, as if dawn had changed her mind, as if the world was holding its breath for something it could not name. Children woke first, as they always did, but they did not run to the water. They stood at their doorways, wide-eyed, waiting for the light that always followed the chill. Mothers lit lamps early. Fathers stepped outside and looked to the east, their hands shielding eyes from a sun that wasn't there. In the temples, priests emerged in silence. No bells, no chants, only the faint echo of sandals brushing cold stone. And in the market square, the vendors stood at their stalls, not selling, not moving, just waiting. The entire city became still, not with fear, not yet, but with a collective, unspoken knowing. Something had changed, and then came the smell, not of smoke, not of fire, but of ash, distant dry, the scent of something ancient burning far away, beyond the marshes, beyond the mountains, a smell that did not belong to Tartessos, but one she now had to breathe. Some say the sun did rise that day, but behind a veil so thick it could not break through. Others say it was not the sun that failed, but the sky itself, folding it on some wound we cannot see. In the silence, the river grew still, more still than water should be, not frozen, but suspended, not dead, but listening. And the animals, the faithful companions of the city, began to act strangely. The dogs curled together in tight circles, whimpering softly. The birds, instead of taking to the skies, lined the rooftops, unmoving. Even the marsh cats, feral, proud, disappeared entirely. The people gathered in the plaza, not to protest, not to panic, but to stand together beneath the sky that would not speak. And it was there, in that breathless half-light, that the first sound came. Not a trumpet, not a scream, but a groan, low, long, rising from deep beneath the earth, as if something below had turned in its sleep. The ground did not quake, the buildings did not sway, but the sound moved through them, through the stones, through the bones of the city, and it felt not angry, not cruel, but tired, as if the world was stretching, reaching, deciding. That was when the people began to whisper the word. End. Not shouted, not cried, just spoken, shared, like breath in cold air, like a name you don't want to forget. And in that moment, something extraordinary happened. They did not run. They did not scream. They prayed, not to gods in bronze, not to foreign names carved in borrowed tongues, but to the memory of themselves. Mothers held daughters. Fathers bowed their heads. The priests knelt in the dirt, their robes trailing ash. And for a heartbeat, the city remembered who it had been, before the trade, before the flood, before the silence. The people closed their eyes and listened, and though no voice answered, no light pierced the sky, no sign arrived, they felt it, that they were being watched, not judged, not punished, but witnessed, as if the world itself, just once, wanted to see how they would face the unknown. And Tartessos, in her final stillness, stood with grace, not pleading, not fighting, but remembering. The sun did not rise that day, not fully, but by nightfall, the sky cleared, and in the blackness that followed, the stars returned, brighter than before, closer perhaps, as if they had moved toward the earth out of longing, not distance. And the people of Tartessos, wrapped in blankets of silence and starlight, understood the sun's absence had not been a punishment. It had been a gift, a moment to see themselves without shadow, without gold, without illusions, just souls, together, in the pause before ending. And tonight, as you drift toward your own dark, remember this. Sometimes the light fails not to destroy, but to let us truly see. When a city begins to feel its own ending, it does not scream. It disguises itself, not to deceive others, but to shield its own heart from the weight of recognition. Tartessos, in her final days, turned not to war or denial, but to masquerade. They called it the Festival of Reflections, though no one quite remembered when it began. Perhaps it had always existed, a ritual born from myth, kept alive through celebration, but changed quietly into something else. As the city unraveled, it started with masks. At first, they were simple, woven from reeds and painted with symbols, spirals, waves, constellations. Each person crafted their own, choosing not a likeness of themselves, but a vision of who they were in dreams. The baker wore a mask shaped like a heron. The elder by the river wore one of fireflies and bone. Children danced as foxes, birds, and stars with wings. No one used their real face. It was not permitted, not because it was shameful, but because this was the only night when truth did not belong to the surface. It belonged to shadow, to suggestion, to revelation through concealment. And so the city became unrecognizable. Familiar voices emerged from unfamiliar forms. The sacred and the profane danced hand in hand. The marketplace transformed into a theater of dreams. Lanterns hung from every archway, glowing not with flame, but with a strange blue light drawn from marsh crystals found only once a year. And in the center of it all stood a mirror, tall, oval, framed in black and silver, its surface smooth as water under moonlight. No one knew where it had come from. It had simply appeared at the mouth of the plaza, leaning slightly, as though weary from time. They called it La Espagia del Ultimo Nombre, the mirror of the last name. The belief was simple. If you stood before the mirror at the height of the festival, at the moment the stars reached their zenith, and removed your mask, you would see not your face, but your truth. Not who you were, not who you pretended to be, but what you had become. Few were brave enough to try. Most chose to keep their masks on, laughing nervously, drifting between dancers and shadows, touching hands without knowing whose they were. But some, the broken-hearted, the curious, the quietly desperate, stepped before the mirror, and what they saw was never spoken aloud. Some wept, some laughed, some fell to their knees and touched their own reflection, as though begging it to stay. One woman collapsed entirely, whispering the name of a child she had never dared to mourn in daylight. Another man vanished after standing before it. Not fled, not escaped, just vanished. His mask found lying on the edge of the marsh, his footprints leading nowhere. And yet, the festival continued, because that was the point. Tartessos was not hiding from outsiders. There were none left. She was hiding from herself. The city had grown too bright, too brittle. Her rituals still sparkled, but the soul behind them had dimmed. And now, in her final masquerade, she danced not to forget, but to soften the blow of remembering. That night, under masks of gods and animals, the people of Tartessos did not cry out for salvation. They did not beg the titans, or the river, or the stars. They danced, because sometimes the most honest thing we can do is move in silence beneath the weight of what we cannot change. As dawn approached, a dawn more gray than gold, the masks were left on the doorsteps. Every doorstep, some hanging gently from windows, others resting beside bowls of extinguished candles. The mirror was gone, vanished with the stars. Only a circle of pressed grass remained where it had stood, as if the earth itself had leaned forward to listen one last time. And the people, barefaced once more, walked home in silence. No one spoke of what they saw. No one dared, because truth, once seen, cannot be placed back behind a mask. And Tartessos, for all her beauty, had finally glimpsed herself in the glass, and knew, with quiet certainty, that her reflection would not return again. Tonight, as you rest in the hush between thoughts, remember this. We all wear masks, but there is a place, somewhere in each of us, where the mirror waits. It does not accuse. It does not shame. It only shows and asks, are you still listening? Not all voices fade when the mouth that bore them is gone. Some become quieter, slower, more delicate than wind, but they remain, tethered to place, to memory, to longing, The people of Tartessos used to say that the air near the marshes was always thick with ghosts. Not the kind that haunt, not the kind that frighten, but the kind that wait. Souls who still needed something. To be remembered, to be named, to be seen once more before the tides returned them to silence. And she was the only one who listened. No one knew her true name. She had once been a child of the city, born into a quiet house near the salt basins, where reeds grew through the cracks in the floor and light came in sideways, soft and green. She had no family, or perhaps she had simply outlived them. Tartessos had a way of gently erasing what it no longer needed. But from the moment she could speak, she spoke not to people, but to what wasn't there. Her voice was soft, patient, measured in breath rather than word. She would sit for hours in the thresholds of ruined temples, her fingers tracing old carvings as though trying to awaken them. At night, she walked the banks of the river with her feet bare and her hands lifted, her mouth moving in a language no one else knew, a tongue only heard in dreams. The priests dismissed her. The traders ignored her. The children watched from a distance, unsure whether to laugh or to pray. But the old ones, those who still remembered the oracle's eyes, the weight of ritual, the breath of the titans beneath the soil, they watched her closely, and they began to call her, simply, she who speaks with shadows. She became a figure of the margins, never seen in the square, never heard in the chants, but always present, in the moments when the wind paused, when the reeds bent in no direction, when the water reflected not sky, but faces long vanished. It was said she knew the names of the dead, even those whose stones had been washed away. She would whisper them gently into the soil near the edge of the garden, then wait, and sometimes the earth would breathe back. In her final days, as the city trembled in silence, she walked deeper into the marshes than any had dared, alone, clothed in rags stained by ash and salt, carrying nothing but a bowl carved from river stone, filled with water drawn under the moon. They say she stopped beside an ancient tree, its trunk split, hollow, filled with birds who did not scatter when she approached. There, she knelt. She poured the water into the soil, not onto it, into it, letting it sink slowly, as though returning something that had never belonged to her. And then she began to speak, not loudly, not in plea, but with the slow cadence of someone welcoming back a forgotten guest. The names she spoke were not written anywhere, not on tablets, not on walls, not even in the minds of those still living. They were names of those who had never been mourned, children lost before breath, lovers whose bodies were never found, servants buried without song, women who had waited too long for return. She named them all, and as she did, the air around her grew dense. The birds above her fell silent. The reeds stopped swaying, as if the world itself leaned in to listen. And when she had spoken the final name, a name no one alive had ever heard, she lay down at the edge of the water, placed the empty bowl over her chest, closed her eyes, and never rose again. By morning, she was gone. No body, no trace, only her footprints, and a ring of stones placed in a perfect spiral around the place where she had knelt. Some say the ghosts took her, that they had waited long enough, and when the final name was spoken, they followed her back across the veil. Others say she became one of them, not a ghost, but a guardian, that even now, when the wind moves strangely through the reeds, when your name is whispered in sleep, when you feel the press of memory in places you've never walked. That is her, calling, not to frighten, but to remind you. The dead do not ask to be worshipped, only remembered. And tonight, as you drift into your own quiet space, as the world fades and the shadows stretch longer across your dreams, listen. You may hear her voice, not speaking, but naming, And if she says your name, do not fear. It means you are still held, still known, still a part of the story that the earth never stopped telling. There are endings that crash, endings that scream and split the sky, that come with fire and fury and 1,000 eyes turned toward ruin. But Tartessos did not fall that way. Tartessos let go, like breath sliding from between parted lips, like a song unfinished but whole in its silence. They say it began as a whisper, not from a temple, not from the river, not even from a wind, but from within the city itself. A subtle shift, a surrender, as though the stones had decided they no longer wished to be part of the illusion. The market did not open that morning. The traders, usually the first to stir, remained in their homes, their stalls untouched, their ledgers closed. The bells of the Temple of the River did not ring, not because they were silenced, but because no hand reached for the rope. There were no announcements, no declarations, only a stillness so complete it felt like reverence. The sun rose low, veiled in mist, casting long, golden shadows that stretched like fingers across rooftops. And the water crept in, not in anger, not as punishment, but as invitation. It began with the lower streets, the ones closest to the marshes, the places where the songs of the old fishermen once echoed off the damp stone. The water climbed gently, as though remembering where it had once belonged. It lapped at thresholds, kissed the edges of broken steps, slipped into doorways like a memory returning home. And the people, they did not run. They watched, some from windows, some from the rooftops, some from the very heart of the city, barefoot in the plaza, hands loose at their sides. There was no panic, only breath, only eyes. They understood now what the river had been trying to say, what the oracle had once wept for, what the gold had tried to warn them of, what the sunless morning had whispered. Let go of the weight, let go of the name, let go of the dream that had become too heavy to carry. And they did. Some families opened their doors and let the water in, lighting candles as it rose, watching them flicker, float, extinguish. Some climbed to the highest point of the city, not to escape, but to witness, to sing, because they sang in those final hours, not in harmony, not with words, but with sound, low, haunting tones passed from voice to voice. A lament, a lullaby, a homecoming. The priestesses stood on the steps of the sunken temple, their robes heavy with salt, their hands open not in plea, but in thanks. They spoke the names of things they would not carry with them. Greed, pride, the forgetting, and the city, hearing its own confession, softened. The statues tilted, the towers groaned, the mosaics cracked not from pressure, but as if exhaling, and then, as the tide rose one final time, knee-deep, then chest, then over the heads of the silent crowd, Tartessos let go. The final breath of the city was not a sound. It was a feeling, a vast, quiet release, like grief that had been held too long, finally finding a place to weep. The water covered her gently, lovingly, not erasing her, but returning her to silence, to myth, to the arms of the Titans sleeping far below. And in the centuries that followed, when ships passed near that shore and felt their compasses turn, or when farmers unearthed strange stones etched with stars, no one spoke of conquest, no one spoke of fire, only of the city that shimmered and sang and slipped into the sea like a secret too beautiful to keep. Tonight, as the tide of sleep rises in you, let go, not of who you are, but of what no longer serves you, of the weight you carry that was never yours, of the mask, of the gold, of the walls. Let your breath move like water into stillness. Let your name fall quiet in the night. And listen, Tartessos is not lost. She is only sleeping beneath the tide, still breathing, still remembering, still waiting. What remains after the song ends? Not the notes, not the breath, not even the echo. What remains is the silence that follows. And that silence is not absence. It is presence returned to itself. When Tartessos surrendered to the sea, when her towers exhaled and her stones sank into salt, what she left behind was not ruin, but a kind of quiet that had not existed since the world was young. This was no ordinary silence. It was not the hush of sleep, not the silence of fear, not even the reverent stillness after morning. It was the silence of completion, of remembering, of coming full circle to the breath before the first word. The survivors, if any remained, never spoke of it, not because they could not, but because they understood that this silence was not to be broken. It was to be carried. In the decades that followed, sailors spoke of a place where compasses slowed, where gulls flew in wide circles and would not land, where the water, though calm, seemed to listen, a place where laughter could not rise above a whisper, where music sounded like a prayer, where even the wind seemed to tiptoe. Divers, centuries later, would descend into the murky shallows near the mouth of the Guadalquivir and come back, changed, not injured, not frightened, but subdued, moved. They would say things like, "There's something down there, but it doesn't want to be found," or "I heard nothing, and I've never heard anything like it since." Some would never dive again. Some, unable to explain the hush in their hearts, would return to the sea again and again, not to explore, but to sit at its edge, to listen, to the silence, because Tartessos had not vanished. She had transformed from a city of light to a city of stillness, from songs sung aloud to songs remembered only in the body. Her stones dissolved, her names faded, but her silence remained, woven into the rhythm of the tides, the hush of reeds, the pause between waves, and that silence began to grow, like a seed beneath ash, like breath behind the chest bone, like myth finding soil again. Pilgrims came, not many, never many, and stood barefoot in the marsh. Hands open, eyes closed, tears on cheeks for reasons they could not name. They didn't come for relics. There were none. They didn't come for answers. Tartessos had no more to explain. They came to sit in the silence, to be inside it, to become it, because something in them still remembered. A city that danced, then dissolved. A people who sang their own ending. A river that listened before it left. And most of all, a silence that was not the void, but the return. The final exhale of a people who had once known how to live without taking, who had forgotten, and who, in the end, remembered just enough to leave gently. Tonight, in your own silence, the one that arrives just before sleep fully wraps you. Listen not for words, but for the space between them. Not for answers, but for the hush beneath the question. That is where Tartessos lives now. Not on any map, not in any ruin, but in you, in your ability to sit still, to remember, to surrender, to let go, in the silence you carry without knowing. And when you dream, if you find yourself walking barefoot through shallow water, the stars above you pulsing, the marsh grass whispering your name, know this. You're not lost. You're simply being welcomed back into the silence. A city that disappears does not become forgotten. It becomes a story, and stories, once freed from stone and soil, do not die. They transform. What Tartessos could not preserve in walls or words, she planted in silence, and silence, like water, finds its own way. What followed her vanishing was not a blank space in memory, but a bloom of myth. She did not become one myth, but many, because the world does not remember perfectly. It remembers poetically. In the centuries that followed her surrender to the sea, the name Tartessos slipped from the mouths of traders and kings, but it returned in the dreams of shepherds, the riddles of oracles, the lullabies of mothers who had no city left to name, but still whispered of a golden shore just beneath the tide. They said there was a place where the sun never set, only curled itself behind a mist of silver leaves, where a queen slept beneath a river and ruled a kingdom of light with a crown of eelgrass, where birds could speak and sang only for those who remembered to listen, where the sky once cracked open and poured stars into bowls made of memory. The Greeks, upon hearing of a city lost to the west, called her Atlantis. Plato wrote of concentric circles, of priests and builders, of temples gleaming like gold. And while scholars debated lines and dates, the poets understood. He wasn't describing a place. He was describing a feeling, a city you miss before you've ever seen it. And that was Tartessos, not a location, not a ruin, but a hunger shaped like memory. In the Pyrenees, travelers told of a mountain that hummed. If you placed your ear against its side, you could hear the breath of a city still dreaming below. In North Africa, desert sages told tales of a woman of salt and silver, who walked across dunes each solstice, her eyes reflecting stars no one else could see. And in the coastal villages of Iberia, some still pour the first jug of spring water into the sea, an offering for the city beneath. They call her many names now: Tartessos, Tarshish, Althassos, even the Mirror City. But they are all speaking of the same thing, a place not destroyed, but returned to the myth that birthed it, to the song that never needed to be sung aloud. The myth of Tartessos is not a tale of failure. It is a tale of reminder that beauty untethered from humility will always lose its roots, that sacredness, once commodified, slips through fingers like water, that silence, once broken too many times, learns to find a new home. But the myth also teaches this, that nothing sacred is ever truly lost. It just changes shape. Tartessos became the place behind places, the city you glimpse in a titipool at dusk, the one you feel in dreams when walking through fog toward a light you cannot name, the hum beneath your ribs when you hear a story that touches something you didn't know you missed. The myth that grew where the city sank is not meant to be solved. It is not a puzzle. It is not a code. It is a mirror held out across time, asking only this: when your own house begins to shimmer too brightly, when your own voice grows louder than the rivers, when your name becomes heavier than your silence, will you remember? Will you remember the city that sang its own ending? The people who placed feathers in flame? The girl who named the dead? The river that waited before it left? Will you remember the story, not as history, but as a map back to stillness? Tonight, in the breath between waking and dream, you may pass through her gates. You may walk the moss-lined paths of her memory, barefoot, unseen. You may reach your hand into the water and feel not wetness, but recognition. And if you do not speak. Just nod. Just smile. Just listen. Because myth is not told. It is felt. And Tartessos, she is still there. Not beneath the sea, but inside the silence you've forgotten how to hold. Before the first city was drawn in clay, before breath was given shape, before words were carved into the bark of time, there were voices, but they did not speak in syllables. They did not sing with tongues or teeth. They spoke in stone, low, endless, patient. The titans, the ancient ones, those who walked before myth, carried their voices within the earth, not in caves, not in temples, but in the deep bones of the world, where silence bends into vibration, and vibration becomes memory, When Tartessos rose from river and ash, she did not rise alone. She rose with the echoes of those voices still beneath her feet, the ones who had shaped the land not by force, but by resonance. They had not built walls. They had tuned the stone. Each hill, each bend in the river, each slab of earth beneath the city was selected not for wealth, but for tone. And when you walked the old roads of Tartessos barefoot, you could feel it, a subtle vibration that pulsed through your soles, like a whisper from the underworld, a language made of depth, not height. The builders knew, the first ones. They did not call themselves architects. They were listeners, men and women who spent days lying flat against the ground, their ears pressed to soil, waiting to hear where the voice was strongest. It was said that in the center of the city, beneath the plaza where dancers once burned feathers in flame, there lay a stone unlike any other. They called it La Piedra del Eco Profundo, the stone of deep echo, not carved, not moved, simply discovered. When struck, it did not ring. It breathed, a slow, bass hum that filled the chest before it reached the ears, a sound not meant to be heard, but remembered. The priests of the early age believed the stone was the mouth of a titan, that its vibration was his dreaming, that as long as the stone hummed, Tartessos would endure. And for centuries, it did. The city was built around that hum. The temples aligned to its rhythm. The rituals followed its pulse. Even the city's name, Tartessos, was chosen for how it sounded. When spoken near stone, it was not about meaning. It was about resonance. But over time, new voices arrived. Sharper, faster, thinner. Voices that wanted to speak, not listen. And the hum of the deep stone was drowned beneath the clamor of markets, the clang of tools, the noise of forgetting. No one lay upon the earth anymore. No one pressed their ear to the stone. They walked past it, over it, around it, as if it had never spoken. But stone is patient. It waits. And in the last days of Tartessos, as the water crept in and the river turned to mourning, and the sky forgot the sun, the stone began to speak again. Those who walked the plaza barefoot reported strange feelings, pressure in the chest, a heaviness in the spine, a sound like thunder beneath the skin. Some collapsed, not in pain, but in recognition. They remembered the hum, not with the mind, but with the body. It spoke not in prophecy, not in warning, but in invitation to return, to listen, to be still enough to become part of the world again. The last child born in Tartessos was said to have been born upon the stone itself. A midwife, guided by dream, carried the mother to the plaza in silence. No lamp, no cloth, only the hum. The child did not cry. He opened his eyes, gray as weathered marble, and exhaled, and the stone answered, a sound no one had heard in centuries. A chord so deep at bedtime. Birds fled. Water paused. Even the wind stopped moving. And for that one breath, the voice of the Titans, ancient and tired and holy, rose again from the belly of the earth and wrapped the city in sound, a sound of ending and a beginning. That child was never seen again. Some say he walked into the marsh and vanished. Others say he became the stone, that the voice did not speak to him, but through him, and that now, when the tides are low and the moon is raw, you can still hear it, the stone, still humming, beneath the salt, waiting, not for resurrection, but for reverence, because stone does not forget, it does not forgive, it does not judge, it only remembers. And tonight, as you lie in your quiet place, feel your body press against the weight beneath you, the floor, the ground, the earth. Close your eyes. Be still. You may feel it too. Not a voice, not a message, but a sound, a pulse, a memory, the echo of something older than gods, older than thought, A city remembered not in stories, but in vibration. Tartessos was never meant to speak forever. She was meant to hum, to resonate, and then return to the deep. But the voice remains, in the stone, in the marrow, in you. There are stories too old to tell, truths so vast they can only be remembered through silence. And at the edge of that silence, in the place beyond myth and memory, beneath the last breath of cities long drowned, the Titans sleep, not dead, not banished, not forgotten, just sleeping in the time, before Tartessos first opened her eyes to the sea, before rivers had names and fire had prayer. The Titans moved through the bones of the earth like dreamers in the dark. They were not creatures of shape. They were not men made larger. They were forces, moments made manifest, breaths that became mountains, regret that became river, gratitude that bloomed into tree. They shaped nothing. They simply were. And the world, in its beginning, moved around them like a heartbeat moves around a thought. But the Titans, vast as they were not untouched by longing. They watched the first humans emerge, small, luminous, trembling with newness. And they felt a strange pull, not of ownership, not of dominion, but of wonder. Here are beings who could speak, not through vibration or stone or tide, but with voice. Here were beings who could choose, who could give without reason, who could love beyond survival. The Titans listened, and as they listened, they slowed. They laid down in the folds of the earth, curled beneath mountain ranges, coiled within riverbeds. And there they closed their eyes, not to escape, but to dream us forward. And so the cities rose, Tartessos among them, not the first, but perhaps the most beloved, built upon the shoulder of one such sleeper. The city learned to move in harmony with the Titan's breath. Her temples rose not in defiance of heaven, but in alignment with the slow, sacred rhythm beneath. Each morning, the priests would press their foreheads to the floor of the inner sanctum, not to pray, but to listen, to the hum, to the sleeping Titan's pulse, deep and slow and constant, a reminder that below all striving, all beauty, all forgetting, there remains something older than light. But time, like all things, bends, and Tartessos, in her brilliance, grew noisy. The markets buzzed, the coins clattered, the gods multiplied, and slowly, without meaning to, they stopped listening. The hum beneath the sanctum became background. The pulse became noise, and the dreamer beneath the city, wrapped in layers of stone and sorrow, turned in its sleep. And when it did, the tide shifted, not as punishment, not as warning, but as balance. Because even Titans must shift to find comfort again. And when they do, the world above moves with them. The river rose, the light dimmed, the silence grew, and Tartessos, sweet, proud, radiant Tartessos, was gently laid back into the soil of time, returned, not erased, returned to the body of the Titan beneath her, cradled in stone, held like a memory no longer needing to be spoken aloud. And there she remains, even now, even tonight. In sleep she is still alive, whispering dreams into the veins of the earth, shaping myth, not as echo, but as invitation. The Titans still sleep, not all but most, their breath winding through cave and current, their presence folded into the architecture of what we call coincidence. And if you ever feel, while walking alone in nature, that the land itself is listening, it is. If you ever sit in stillness and feel a pressure, not heavy, but warm, settle around your ribs, that is one of them turning slightly in sleep, letting you know you're not alone. You are never alone. You're walking across a back, sleeping. You're dreaming on a chest, breathing. You're being carried even now, through a world still shaped by those who came before words. And tonight, as your eyes grow heavy, let yourself rest not on a mattress, but in the palm of something ancient. Let your breath slow to match the rhythm of stone. Let your heart move with the pulse of myth. And know, deep in a silent place beyond fear, that you're being held by what cannot be named, held by what cannot die, held by a titan, still dreaming, beneath the last breath of Tartessos. Not all cities are made of stone. Not all ruins lie beneath water. Some cities are built in the body, not the flesh, not the bone, but the deeper architecture, the places beneath language, beneath thought, where memory becomes instinct and myth becomes sensation. Tartessos was never meant to live forever in maps. She was never meant to be cataloged, excavated, or placed behind glass. She was meant to become part of us, and she did. Though her towers fell, though her name was buried, though her river turned from song to silence, Tartessos survived, inside you, because every civilization once lived and loved enough. Plant seeds in the blood. You feel it in moments too quiet to explain. When you wake just before dawn and feel you are being watched, not by danger, but by something old and kind. When your chest tightens at the sound of bells, even though they ring nowhere near. When you walk barefoot and the earth beneath your feet feels familiar. These are not accidents. These are the echoes of a city that lives in your body. Her plazas are the spaces behind your ribs. Her temples rise with every breath you draw slow and full. Her river runs in the pathways of your nerves, carrying stories instead of blood. Even the silence you carry, the one you've never quite been able to name, is hers. It is the silence of a people who learned too late. That presence was always more powerful than possession. That reverence was not something you gave to gods, but something you lived every day, in how you moved, how you touched, how you remembered. You've felt it, haven't you? The ache for something you've never seen. A homesickness not for a place, but for a feeling. That's Tartessos. She does not haunt. She hums. She is the low, vibrating pull behind the chest bone when you look at ruins and feel your eyes sting. She is the instinct to place your hand on a tree without knowing why. She is the breath you hold when entering a sacred space, even if you don't call it sacred. She is in you, because you are made of all the cities that came before you. The ones that rose with hope, that glowed with gold, that learned and forgot and fell. And in falling, they left behind their most precious treasure. Not architecture, not artifacts, but a rhythm carried in a marrow, passed through generations, until it found you, until it woke up one morning inside your silence and whispered, remember, not with facts, not with dates, but with sensation, with how you soften when the light bends just right through a window, with how your hands instinctively cradle what is fragile, with how, in your loneliest hour, you still know how to kneel. You are not the end of the story. You are its continuation. Tartessos lives in you, in your longing, in your restraint, in your beauty that no longer needs to shout. And tonight, as you return to your own stillness, close your eyes and ask your body, what cities live inside me? What rivers run through my sleep? What songs are buried beneath my breath? Listen, you may not hear words. You may not see towers, but you will feel something shift, some forgotten room inside you glowing faintly again. That is Tartessos, not rising, not returning, but remembering. And in that remembering, you're becoming her again. Every collapse carries a message, not a warning, not a punishment, but a lesson, a truth too sacred to be shouted, too heavy to be passed through words alone. Tartessos did not fall suddenly. She unwound herself like a thread pulled gently from a tapestry. She came undone by her own forgetting, and in that unraveling, she taught us more than her triumphs ever could, because collapse is not always catastrophe. Sometimes collapse is correction, a return, a remembering, a surrender so deep, so deliberate, that it becomes an act of devotion. Tartessos grew vast, beautiful, powerful. Her markets sparkled with silver. Her rivers danced with song. Her temples reached skyward in praise of the world's abundance. But slowly, too slowly to see, she began to worship not the source of the light, but the reflection of it. Gold replaced reverence. Trade replaced communion. Speed replaced stillness. The rituals remained, but their meaning drifted like mist. Their words were repeated, but no longer felt. And that is where the collapse began. Not in the earth, not in the sea, but in the soul. You see, Tartessos did not die because of what she lacked. She collapsed beneath the weight of what she refused to remember. The world had always given her everything. Rich soil, gentle tides, stars that bent their light toward her shores. But abundance without humility becomes a curse. And sacredness without attention becomes performance. And so little by little, the foundation cracked. Not because it was weak, but because it was no longer aligned. No longer in tune with the breath of the river. No longer synchronized with the hum of the stone. No longer whispering the names of the dead. And the collapse came not as fire, not as vengeance, but as a return. The waters rose to reclaim what had once listened. The stones softened beneath feet that no longer paused. The sky grew dim, not in anger, but in grief. And the people watched, and in their final stillness, they understood. The city did not belong to them. It never had. They had been stewards, not owners. And in letting go, they returned the city to something greater than possession. They returned her to meaning. That is the lesson of the collapse. That greatness is not measured in walls or wealth, but in how softly a people can hold what is sacred. That endurance is not about resisting change, but about moving with it. That endings are not failures, but invitations to pause, to breathe, to ask again what matters now. Tartessos is gone, yes, but in her collapse, she left behind not rubble, but wisdom. The wisdom that silence is stronger than pride. That listening is holier than declaring. That beauty without gratitude becomes brittle. And you who carry pieces of this myth in your bones, you who have cities of your own, built in habits and beliefs and old, unexamined foundations, you too will face collapses. You too will watch towers fall, ideas crumble, certainties dissolve. Let them, not because they are wrong, but because they have finished their speaking. Let the water rise. Let the stone sigh. Let the silence wrap around what must now be released. Collapse is not the end. It is the clearing, the space made sacred again. So something new may begin. And tonight, as you surrender your weight to the bed, as your body drifts closer to stillness, know this. You're not breaking. You are returning. You're not failing. You're listening. And somewhere, deep within the silence, Tartessos hums her last lesson. Fall gently, for you are not falling apart. You are falling back into yourself. Some things are not built to last, not because they are weak, but because they are sacred. And sacred things, real sacred things, do not anchor themselves to permanence. They pass, like fire, like wind, like breath between two lovers, gone before it is fully noticed, but still warming the ribs long after. Tartessos was one such thing. She was never meant to be eternal. She was meant to be felt, like a dream so vivid you carry it for days, even as the details fade, like a perfume worn by someone you loved long ago, still lingering in a room you forgot you remembered. She was not a monument. She was a moment. And like all moments, she passed. But here, at the very edge of her story, we must ask, what remains? What survives the city when the stone is ash, when the gold is tarnished, when even the name has lost its shape? The answer is not in ruins, not in relics, not in scrolls buried in salt. The answer is dust and memory. Dust, the final form of everything that once gleamed, once towered, once claimed its place above the earth. Dust settles gently, without pride. It clings to what is still. It softens the edges of grief. It is not decay. It is return. The dust of Tartessos now lines the bottom of forgotten marshes. It sleeps between stones and temples that no longer sing. It rests on the shoulders of strangers who walk unaware, through fields where songs once rose like incense. And in that dust, quiet, unassuming, is everything she ever was. The faces that laughed, the hands that built, the salt that stung, the feathers that burned, the prayers that failed, the silences that forgave. All of it is there, carried not forward in legacy, but dispersed, so that she could become everywhere. And the memory? The memory is not history. It is not data or citation or truth wrapped in stone. It is the shape of something felt without knowing why. It is the grief you feel when standing in a place you've never been and still recognize. It is the voice that calls to you when you're most still, not by name, but by presence. It is the part of you that slows when you see the ocean stretch wide and endless. And you know, somehow, that someone once stood there, long before you, with the same ache behind their eyes. That's what Tartessos left behind. Not a civilization, but a frequency. A way of being that moves like light through stained water, coloring everything without clinging to anything. So no, she was never meant to last, because what was sacred about her was not her endurance, but her passing, and the gift she leaves us, if we are still enough to receive it, is this. That beauty is not in the keeping. It is in the letting go. That meaning does not grow from permanence, but from the willingness to be touched, and then transformed, that we too will one day fall. Our towers, our stories, our names. But if we fall like Tartessos, with grace, with music, with memory placed gently into the river, then we too may become something more. Not stone, not empire, but dust that remembers, and memory that forgives. Tonight, as you prepare to close your eyes, feel the weight of all that has passed through you, all that you have built, all that you have lost, all that you have loved, and let it settle. Let it become dust, not because it is gone, but because it is ready to become part of everything. Tartessos ends here, but you do not. You carry her now, in your pause, in your tenderness, in your silence. The last breath of the Titans was never a goodbye. It was a reminder that all that matters will pass, and all that passes, if remembered with love, remains.